All right, everybody. So, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, yesterday we actually did kind of like a short tafsir, and we pretty much went and talked about Abu Abdullah al-Tirmidhi, who is actually known as al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi. And we kind of talked about that accusation that he was accused of, which is considering that there's awliya, that they have a khatam, meaning that there's a seal, there's a special, let's say, position that the awliya, or at least the saints, would have, and that it was a claim that was something that I would say Abu Abdullah al-Tirmidhi was accused of. And we went in details in regards to that accusation and how other scholars had simply at least rejected that accusation and didn't necessarily have the detailed rebuttals. But that accusation, of course, the most important rebuttal against that this is something that no Muslim or a random or a simple Muslim would claim, let alone a scholar. So we went in details with, well, what is a wali? Just small details, not really thorough, because I already have a complete lecture in regards to al-awliya and who are they and what makes a wali in such details. So go to some of those lectures, inshallah. Yesterday's lecture was kind of like, I would say, speaking about some of those things that people would usually ask about: the déjà vu, I guess, the inspiration, the intuition, and so forth. Okay, so let's continue with our tafsir right there. And it was really in regards to this hadith. So let's see. Abu Abdullah al-Tirmidhi al-Hakim, that is different than Abu Isa al-Tirmidhi. He basically had quoted that Anas ibn Malik had said, ما أكل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم على خوان قط ولا في سكرجة ولا خبز له مرقق. So wait a minute, what does that actually mean? That the Prophet ﷺ did not eat on a khiwan, and what a khiwan is, so it's kind of like a table. So here we go. That's why Abu Abdullah Tirmidhi is saying, well, khiwan, he said, شيء محدث فعلته الأعاجم. So it wasn't something that the Arab had known. It wasn't a cultural practice that they were practicing. So it was pretty much presenting food on, I would say, that was going to be not necessarily a table, more of a Japanese table, probably. It's not too high to be as high as a table, but something a little bit lower. So that was basically the khiwan. And wala fi sukurujja. What is a sukurujja? So the sukurujja would pretty much be a bowl, with a bowl that you would put soup in and all of that. Well, that wasn't something that was familiar during that time, so they didn't really have that. And that's why Abu Abdullah al-Tirmidhi was actually saying right here, it wasn't something that لم تكن العرب لتمتهنها. What would that mean? So in other words, it wasn't their cultural practice, but it doesn't necessarily make it haram to eat in bowls or to eat on tables. It was their cultural practice that they used to eat on is sufar. So sufar, the way that they used to do it was, so think of, let's say, I would say, like a sheet, or think of a sheet, but it would have on its ends, it would have some holders on the ends in order to kind of pull it away. So in order to spread it, and that was the sufra. Okay, but what it was made of, it was usually made of leather. So it was made of leather, and simply the reason why they needed the end holders was because leather, if you were to crumble it all up, or if you were to roll it up, what happens is that it kind of stays within that position because it's hard. So they needed something to pull it and stretch it out. So that was those stretchers, those I guess those stretchers to spread out. Those I guess those so those were basically so those were basically those, I guess, those simple, let's call it those simple mats that they had used in order to put the food on it. And simply that was what this hadith was really explaining, that the Prophet ﷺ did not eat in bowls. Doesn't necessarily make it haram, but that wasn't something that was common during their times. وَلَا خُبِزَ لَهُ مُرَقَّقٌ. خُبِزَ لَهُ مُرَقَّقٌ. So we're speaking about bread that was necessarily baked right now, and it's basically soft and tender. He didn't have that. That wasn't something that was available, at least to him. So that's why I guess Anas ibn Malik wanted to present that the Prophet ﷺ was eating in a very simple way, was whether the way that it was presented or whether it was the actual recipe, things were really simple. He was a very poor man. And just an idea, when you're talking about this simple presentation, it's to give us an idea how the Prophet ﷺ was living. And let's see, القرطبي said هذا حديث صحيح ثابت اتفق على رجاله البخاري ومسلم. So this hadith is an authentic hadith, and the chain of narration that this hadith has, he says there it's basically the same chain of narration that al-Bukhari and both Muslim had also basically depended on. Okay, so this is just an idea, but here's the question. So if we basically do not have sukurujja, if the Prophet ﷺ didn't have sukurujja, can we necessarily use it? Okay, so now, you know, right there, you could see that al-Qurtubi was saying, well, sukurujja, we're speaking about awiyat al-asbagh. What that doesn't necessarily mean awiyat al-asbagh to meaning colorful foods, but that was more of soups. So we're talking about bowls, we're speaking about foods that require, let's say, positioning where they don't spill. And that's why he said awiyatul asbagh. In other words, it wasn't something that was it wasn't something that was spread. Let's see, the sister is saying in Arabic culture, is it common for people to eat from a shared dish and sometimes food may spill onto the table or mat? However, is this the Prophet ﷺ? Not quite. It isn't. Okay, let me explain this one. So there's a difference between a sunnah that the Prophet ﷺ had recommended or the Prophet ﷺ had practiced himself, and from a religious standpoint, in between a practice that was known during that time. Okay, so this is one of those things that the Prophet ﷺ didn't eat in a sukurujja, but that in bowls, that is, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're not allowed to eat in bowls. It wasn't a common tradition at that time to eat in bowls. So their foods didn't contain a lot of water. Their foods didn't contain the stews, let's say it that way. It was very simple, and simply that's why it was الثريد عليه مقطعات اللحم. It was more where it's, of course, let's say bulk of food that probably had some meat, etc., of course, because they didn't necessarily have all that vegetation that would necessarily be available to them. So they basically used, of course, very simple ingredients to cook their food, and the simple ingredients definitely didn't contain a lot of water. So you could see that they didn't need the sukurujja. The sukurujja itself, the word sukurujja, is not even a Arabi word. So you could see that it was imported perhaps from the Persians, because the Persians were the ones that had the sukuruja slash bowls, because of course, if you don't have a Arabic word for the bowl, you would know that they didn't actually have or need it. So that's why when the sukuruja, or when those bowls were imported, the name for it was also imported with it. Just, just kind of see how the words, the names of things, kind of like right now you could see iPhones, for example. You don't have an Arabic word for an iPhone, and it's basically a word that we would say phone, and pretty much in the Chinese, I don't know if they call it a phone or not, but I would assume that most languages right now would use the word phone, and or at least part of the word phone, and they would use it based on, of course, the person that probably invented the phone. Okay, so this is just an idea. So let's see. Well, when we're speaking about the Ma'idah, of course, does that mean that this is an inspiration that we cannot eat on tables? That Prophet Isa alayhi salam, that they had something that was like a table, something that kind of rose the food? Is that necessarily an inspiration that we could say? Well, not necessarily, because the word ma'idah can mean an elevated food. We're speaking about elevated like on a table or something. It could also refer to metaphorically to the actual food itself. So when we see that the Prophet ﷺ used to eat ala sufar, in other words, it was on the floor, it was presented that way, because that was their culture, it does not necessarily mean that we cannot eat on tables, or that we have to have one shared bowl, or at least one shared tray, and everybody's eating from it, and that it would spill. No, it wasn't necessarily spilling, because they didn't actually have stews anyways. So they didn't need those sukurujas slash those bowls, because it wasn't common in their, at least let's call it in their in their kitchen, or at least in their diet, to have those kind of stews, or at least those kind of foods that would be very watery or very aqueous. Okay, so they were mainly solid foods than something that was watery, or something that contained a lot of fluids. Okay, so unlike, for example, perhaps the Byzantines, or at least the Roman Empire, or perhaps other cultures, like of course the nearby Persian culture, they definitely had a civilization where they were capable of making water resource more available. Perhaps the water resources were bringing definitely better vegetation, and the better vegetation was bringing in creative ways to make recipes, to make, I guess, the usage of perhaps of whatever I guess they were finding within their geographical area, that was something that was available. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it would be haram. So what's the evidence to prove that? Let's see. This hadith, Ibn Abbas, he said, لو كان الضب حراما ما أكل على مائدة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. He said, لو كان الضب حراما. What is a dub? A dub is, maybe we could show you a dub right there, just to get an idea of what a dub looks like. Okay, so this was a dub right there, this lizard right there. The Prophet ﷺ didn't eat this kind of lizard. He didn't eat this kind of lizard, not necessarily because it was haram, but because he didn't have a taste for it. It wasn't something within his culture to eat that. But when the Sahaba had asked if they were able, or if they would be permitted to eat from al-Dab, the Prophet ﷺ, he basically said, you can eat, but I did not find it as something that is presented in my own personal culture. So I guess he just didn't have the taste for it. Okay, so let's see. He said, that is quote Ibn Abbas, if al-Dab, that is this particular lizard, if it was haram, it would not have been eaten on the Prophet ﷺ's maid. It would not have been presented on the Prophet ﷺ's, I guess, table. The Prophet ﷺ didn't eat from it, or the Sahaba were there eating in front of the Prophet ﷺ, making it into a barbecue or probably grilling it or whatever it is, but it was there. It was on the same tray that the Prophet ﷺ had eaten from, but the Prophet ﷺ himself did not eat from it. So this is just to let us know that something can be halal, but the Prophet ﷺ himself did not necessarily practice, did not necessarily consume. It doesn't make it haram. Okay, so that's why al-Qurtubi wanted to present this hadith just to let us know that whether we're speaking about perhaps the different kinds of trays or perhaps the different kinds of, let's say, practices, whether it's couches, tables, probably cars as transportation, or just different things that we might use within our times or during our times or within our area and culture, that doesn't necessarily make it haram. Let's look at this hadith because it rather, I would say, comes in as perhaps containing some ambiguity. Let's see. Sayyida Aisha said that the Prophet ﷺ said, تُصَلِّي الْمَلَائِكَةُ عَلَى الرَّجُلِ مَا دَامَتْ مَائِدَتُهُ مَوْضُوعًا. Now, literally, this is going to be the wrong translation, but I'm going to tell you what a random Arabi would understand from this hadith, and then we'll explain what this means. So that the angels would pray on the person as long as their food is basically on the table. This is the wrong translation. Okay, so this is what a random Arabi would think, that, okay, well, I just have to make sure that there's always food on the table. The answer is no, that's not what it means. What this is talking about is basically that the malaika would pray for the person, to mean that they would do istighfar for that person as long as they always have a meal to share with others. Okay, so it's a meal to share with others. This is a sign or at least a representation of hospitality, and not necessarily that they would always have some food on the table and they're just, I guess, coming to eat and snatch some food here and there. So that's not what it means, but this is talking about always having something to share and basically not rush. So when you're presenting some food for your guests, or at least for the people that are in need to eat, that you don't rush in basically taking the food basically back into your fridge, but you're letting your guests take the time to eat from that meal and rather rush in keeping it away. So then the malaika would do istighfar for that person as long as they're presenting that hospitality, they're sharing their food with other people and so forth. Okay, so let's continue right there just really quick, because I promised that it would be something really short. وإذ قال الله يا عيسى ابن مريم أأنت قلت للناس اتخذوني وأمي إلهين من دون الله قال سبحانك ما يكون لي أن أقول ما ليس لي بحق إن كنت قلته فقد علمت تعلم ما في نفسي ولا أعلم ما في نفسك إنك أنت علام الغيوب. Okay, so the scholars actually, when you look at this ayah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told Prophet Isa alayhi salam, the son of Mary, did you tell the people to take you or to take me, that is basically Isa alayhi salam himself, and his mother as a deity other than the Lord Almighty? He said, glory be to you, I would not say something that I do not have the right to say. If I had said it, you would have known it. You know what is basically what is happening, at least of what my intentions are, what I'm thinking, thinking in myself, and I don't know what you basically conceal. And إنك أنت علام الغيوب, for you are the one that knows all al-ghayb. I want you to look at the word al-ghayb. Al-ghayb actually means something that is concealed, something that is hidden. So whether we're speaking about the past, or whether we're speaking about the future, or whether we're speaking about something that you don't have access to knowing probably happening in the present moment. So I don't know probably what Layla Ali is probably doing right now. Okay, that would be ghaib. So the scholars actually had differences of opinions. When is this quote resembling, is it resembling Judgment Day? What, that this is going to be said on Judgment Day, basically during the time when the Prophet ﷺ, or when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not the Prophet ﷺ, but when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let's look at those ayat and just go back to those ayat, sorry, but here we go. Okay, here we go. So is it necessarily coming in when this ayah was basically saying يوم يجمع الله الرسل فيقول ماذا أجبتم? Okay, let's say, is it necessarily coming within this context? Or, so look at this one. Is it coming in with the context إذ قال الله يا عيسى ابن مريم? Is that coming in with the context يوم يجمع الله الرسل فيقول ماذا أجبتم? Is it coming within the context of Judgment Day? Is this basically coming at that time? Or are we looking at that the context of this is at a different timing? Is this necessarily something that Prophet Isa alayhi salam will literally say? Or is this lisanul hal? What's the difference between lisanul hal and lisanul maqal? Lisanul maqal would be something that he literally said. Lisanul hal would be that the person is not literally saying, but the person is in a state, or at least in a situation, and their situation is basically speaking of that. So it's kind of like, you see, we had said this before. We're speaking about, let's say, somebody coming in, running, and they're swiftly going into our house and all of that and closing the door. What would you say? Well, you would say, well, this person came in scared. Did they say that they were scared? No. But the way that they probably closed the door behind them, they came in, and it was really speaking of lisanul hal, the situation, the circumstances, the behavior that they were presenting was actually presenting a situation of fear, and therefore this is to let us know lisanul hal. Is this necessarily lisanul hal, or is this lisanul maqal, to literally say that the Prophet Isa alayhi salam will be questioned in such, and what does that mean? Okay, so that's that area of differences of opinions between scholars. So you had some scholars like Suddi and Qutrub. Qutrub is basically a scholar in Lugha Arabiya, and he basically said, well, that was going to be something when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would raise him in the heavens. And of course, you could see, is this necessarily while he was being raised? Is this on Judgment Day? Is this going to basically tell us lisanul hal? What does this really mean? And right there, Al-Qurtubi said, وَالْأَوَّلُ أَصَحُ يدل عليه ما قبله. And he said that the first interpretation, which is that this would be a conversation between Prophet Isa alayhi salam and the Lord Almighty, and that it would basically be something to happen on Judgment Day, because this would be, as think of it, the Quran itself comes in. Yes, you do have a surah, but even the surah would have chapters. So the surah is a chapter, certainly, but then there would be, let's say, the subchapter, and then you've got a subcategory and so forth. So Al-Qurtubi considered that the starting of this new chapter, at least within this chapter, let's call it a subchapter, is basically starting from يَوْمَ يَجْمَعُ اللَّهُ الرُّسُلَ. on the day when the Lord Almighty would gather all the prophets, and therefore he basically considered that that goes within that context, and that within that context, that Prophet Isa alayhi salam would be questioned on Judgment Day. Did you tell the people to take you and your mother as deities other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? But of course, certainly it's not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't know, but this is to, one, let the Christians know what really the mission, the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent with Prophet Isa alayhi salam. And of course, certainly this is to inform us as Muslimin, and to inform the Christians, and to inform all those that were conducting studies on the theology, or at least the aqidah of Prophet Isa alayhi salam, what had actually happened. So it would present it in a form of this question: what really was the aqidah, and what really did the Prophet Isa alayhi salam really preach? So وَيَوْمَ يَجْمَعُ اللَّهُ الرُّسُلَ, and it is similar to هَذَا يَوْمُ يَنْفَعُ الصَّادِقِينَ صِدْقُهُم. When this, you could say, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, this is the day that those that had been committed to honesty, but this isn't necessarily talking about honesty. This is talking about, we mentioned that ayah before, this is talking about the commitment to the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the day where that commitment would basically come into their service. Basically, that commitment would come into their service. So therefore, the same idea, هذا يوم, and simply coming in and saying, well, just as when it was saying هذا يوم ينفع الصادقين صدقهم, and coming in with the same idea that it is presenting, well, what really is going to happen on that day. Certainly the part of speech for this ayah is coming in هذا يوم, this is the day, and speaking about يوم يجمع الله الرسل, and speaking about it that this is more of a future thing, but it would talk about it like if it's a present speech. And that's why it would say ولو ترى إذ فزعوا, as if if you were to say the way that they would be extremely afraid when Jahannam would be presented to them. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. So you could see that in Lugha Arabiya, in the Quran, sometimes it would give you a past, the past tense, and sometimes it would give you the future tense, and it is to keep you within this presentation, that it is to keep it in mind that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one, is aware of what will happen in the future as much as he is aware of what is happening during our times, and even in the past, because time does not confine the Lord Almighty, and he is beyond time and beyond space. So now you could see, he said, well, this is to tell us when a certain let's say part of speech where it's probably coming in the past tense, this is in order to present لتحقيق أمره وظهور برهانه كأنه قد وقع. يا سلام. He said the ayat may come in the past tense in order to tell us that this is something that there's no doubt that will take place. لتحقيق أمره. It is for sure going to be happening. It is an affirmed tense, because you would only speak of something that is affirmed only if it was in the past tense. And certainly sometimes the future tense would also mean that it is to tell you that there's no doubt that this is going to happen. So this is in order to say this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically affirmed or confirmed or even told us is going to happen, and that there's no doubt in it, as if it had something, as if it had already had happened. Okay, similar as وَنَادَى أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ أَصْحَابَ الْجَنَّةِ. The ayah says, and the people of the hellfire, they had called, look at that past tense right there, they had called the people of Jannah, even though well, certainly we could see that this is in the past tense, but this isn't something that had already happened. It didn't happen, but this is to let us know, for us to live the situation, that there is no doubt that such a thing and such an event would take place. Okay, so right there اختلف أهل التأويل في هذا السؤال وليس هو باستفهام وإن خرج مخرج الاستفهام. So of course the scholars of tafsir, they had differences of opinions on when you're looking at this ayah. أأنت قلت للناس اتخذوني? Is it coming in as basically a form of an interrogative clause? Is this an interrogative clause, or is this an informative clause? Because the Prophet or the Prophet Isa alayhi salam, of course, certainly Prophet Isa alayhi salam did not at all say that he was God or he was the deity that they were supposed to be worshiping instead of God, not him and certainly not his mother. So definitely the Lord Almighty had known that this was not whatsoever something that Prophet Isa alayhi salam had done. So that's why, because it's coming in as an interrogative clause, or some scholars said it wasn't an interrogative clause, but it was more of an informative clause to let us know of some of the things that basically that the people that are reading this, the Christians that are hearing this, for them to see that it's coming in the form of interrogative clause, but it is in order to bring it as an informative clause and in order to bring about توبيخا لمن ادعى ذلك. So therefore, this is coming as an interrogative clause, but this interrogation, when do you interrogate? You interrogate when someone is in a place of suspicion. But certainly, Prophet Isa alayhi salam is not the one who's in place of suspicion. The ones that are in place of suspicion, and certainly this is coming in as scolding not Prophet Isa alayhi salam, but scolding that had made the claim that Prophet Isa alayhi salam had claimed that he was the deity, or his mother was also the deity instead of the Lord Almighty. So you could say that's the first interpretation, that this is an interrogative clause, but not interrogating Prophet Isa alayhi salam, but presenting it in the context of Isa alayhi salam being interrogated. But the real matter is that this is an informative clause becoming in an interrogation method, in order to let the Christians know, and here at least the Christians or those that would question what Prophet Isa alayhi salam had come with, that of course it's coming in to rebuke whoever claims such a claim. Okay, let's see. The second interpretation is that this is basically an informative clause to let others know that they had changed the actual mission, the actual message that Prophet Isa alayhi salam had come with, and they had claimed what Prophet Isa alayhi salam did not whatsoever say. Therefore, Prophet Isa alayhi salam was within this context basically interrogated, but it was not an interrogation. So pretty much you could say, you're like, well, you're saying the same thing. I would say you're actually right. Sometimes the mufassirin can say things differently, but in the end, I would say the inference is quite the same, but it's just presenting the wording differently. I guess sometimes it can happen. We can say things differently, and we can be very particular on the type of sentence that we're probably using, but in inference, it's probably meaning the actual same thing. All right. قال سبحانك ما يكون لي أن أقول ما ليس لي بحق إن كنت قلته فقد علمته. And you could see Abu Hurairah said تلقى عيسى حجته ولقاه الله في قوله إذ قال الله يا عيسى ابن مريم. Okay. So Prophet Isa alayhi salam, you could see Prophet Isa alayhi salam, he said قال سبحانك ما يكون لي أن أقول ما ليس لي بحق. So the interrogation, Prophet Isa alayhi salam comes in response to saying, basically, all the glory be unto you. I would not say something that you had not given me the permission to say. In other words, I was only preaching exactly what you had taught me. And that is coming in as a response to let the followers, or at least those that would claim following Prophet Isa alayhi salam's message, to let them know that Prophet Isa's message was always coming to glorify the Lord Almighty, and that he would not make a claim or preach other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told him to preach. So this is basically فَلَقَّاهُ اللَّهُ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَلَقَّاهُ اللَّهُ, that Prophet Isa alayhi salam, during that question, he had basically been disciplined, been taught how to respond. And this is the adab. This is the adab by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so let's see. And here, Abu Isa, and then remember, this Tirmidhi is different than Abu Abdullah Tirmidhi, the one that we had talked about before. And you could see that Prophet Isa alayhi salam started out in responding to the question, to the interrogative clause, did you tell the people to worship me and your mother instead of the Lord Almighty? He started out by saying, قال سبحان الله. He started out by saying, all the glory be to you, Almighty, and therefore this is تنزيها له عما أضيف إليه. This is basically to let others and to basically teach us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's no one similar to the Lord Almighty, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala holds the highest rank, and that anything that was claimed or attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is not befit to say about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Prophet Isa alayhi salam starts out with Subhanak. There's nothing like unto you, nothing compared to you. And the word Subhanak, meaning that you are the center, you are beyond all. There's nothing that matches your orbit, nothing that matches your power, nothing that matches your ilm, nothing matches you in your nobility, nothing matches whatsoever. So therefore, I could not be, neither me or my mother can whatsoever be in any shape or form or in any way at a close nobility or close magnificence to you as the Lord Almighty. So therefore, this is خُضُوعًا لِعِزَّتِهِ. This is to announce that he is basically submitting to his magnificence and certainly fearing satwata, fearing his magnificence as well. So you could see, أنت قلت للناس اتخذوني وأمي إلهين. So here's a question. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked that question, or at least this interrogative clause, or at least this ayah coming in as an interrogative way. Some of the scholars actually said that there was this fear that this question, or at least this interrogative clause, comes in and containing some anger. But is that anger coming in at Prophet Isa alayhi salam, or is this coming at the listeners, or at least those that had claimed such a claim? And certainly it was not about Prophet Isa alayhi salam. But despite that, even though the interrogative clause was not necessarily directed at Prophet Isa alayhi salam, but Prophet Isa alayhi salam was also fearful of that word. So he said, Subhanak, even though he knew that he was not the one being questioned here. It was basically directed at those that had made this claim. But despite all that, Prophet Isa alayhi salam was fearful of the question. So there's that ra'da, or that fear. And I want you to keep in mind here, when we would say, we talked about this before, are all the prophets not going to be لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون, or there certain positions or / stations on Judgment Day, where there will be fear that will overcome everyone. So certainly there are certain stations on Judgment Day where everyone would be afraid, would fear. And of course, the people, basically the Salihin, the prophets, the rest of the random people, the kuffar, not everybody is at the same level of fear, because we could see people would vary, and the highest level of fear would basically be for those that had not expected Judgment Day to come, not expected that they would be resurrected. They did not expect any of that. So that's when, of course, they would be in the highest level of fear. But for the Anbiya and the Salihin, their level of fear would not be at the climax. They would still be afraid. They would still get into this rahba, at least this magnificence, where they would feel it, but not at the same level of those that had opposed, those that had rejected the word of the Lord Almighty. Okay, so ما يكون لي أن أقول ما ليس لي بحق. In other words, I would not have the right, I would not whatsoever claim to myself or give myself in any shape or form a higher ranking position than the position that you had obligated me to inform them, that is the prophethood. And therefore, whatsoever, I did not claim that I was the deity, I was the Lord, or I contained any form or shape of being God or to the one to be worshipped. And if I had claimed such a claim, you would basically know all of that. You would have known about it. And therefore, there comes in that other adab, that Prophet Isa alayhi salam. So let's look into that. He said, Subhanak, that's the first adab. 2, ما يكون لي أن أقول ما ليس لي بحق. Now comes the second form, and saying, well, I would not have the right to preach something that I basically get my preaching from you. In other words, all the different teachings, I would basically take it as an inspiration from you. And in kuntu qultuhu faqad alimta. And if I would have said that, you would have known it. That's basically to say, number one, this is speaking about the glory of the Lord Almighty. 2, this is talking about ubudiyya. This is talking about submission to the Lord Almighty. And 3, this is confessing that the ilm goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here, this is coming in as being humble. تعلم ما في نفسي ولا أعلم ما في نفسك. This is to come in as khushu'. You would basically know what is in me, but there's no way that I would know what is in you. إنك أنت علام الغيوب. I want to look at this one, because this sentence, we break it down as just reading it and just translating it, but it actually contains a lot more than that. So Subhanak comes in to admit. Remember what we said about not prophet, but about al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, and how he said, if the person is not familiar with the right ways of ubudiyyah, with the right ways of submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they would not know rububiyyah, they would not really know the Lord Almighty. So in other words, if you submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in perhaps your salah, then you would recognize the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his place of ibadah. In other words, you would submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in worship. Okay, if you were to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his principles, that's how you would recognize the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as he is al-Hakim, he is al-Khabir, he is the one that we take his knowledge surpasses my knowledge, and therefore you would embrace that knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you would sense it. You would recognize what it means to embrace Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name, Al-Alim, Al-Khabir, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Jabbar. You wouldn't really know what it means. You wouldn't really feel the name unless you live the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Only then would you really recognize that? You would not know what it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Jabbar, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Qahar, unless you've learned how to practice patience, because you would recognize to contain your emotions when you recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His orders basically go beyond your will, I guess, what you would really want. So that's when you would embrace the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala al-Qahhar. You would embrace the name al-Jabbar. You would embrace the name that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Razzaq, when you actually practice patience. Okay, so when you see qala subhanak, you can see Prophet Isa alayhi salam is practicing a form now of recognizing the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He is al-Aziz, that every power goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He is basically the magnificent. He is basically the one to be at the highest rank of any form of izzah, any form of power, any form or shape, of course, of no one being like unto Him. ما يكون لي أن أقول ما ليس لي بحق. I would not have the power or the permission to say anything unless you would give me. Now this one comes in as al-ubudiyya, as the submission. Remember, when we speak about tawheed, number one, recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's magnificence in His essence. Number two, recognizing the submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in worship. So this is in worship right there. Okay, this is recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's magnificence in His essence. This is recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's magnificence in worship, and certainly that I would not basically do anything unless you had given me this parameter, or at least the permission to do something. إن كنت قلته فقد علمت. If I would have said that, you would have known it. This is to give the other form of recognition in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If I would have said that, you would have known it. In other words, I don't have the ilm that you have. And to complete that, تَعْلَمُ مَا فِي نَفْسِي, you would know what I basically conceal, but there's no way that I have the power, even as a prophet, to know what you had concealed. So when you look at the word مَا فِي نَفْسِك, this basically is metaphorical to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had concealed certain information that even the prophets themselves do not know. So therefore, right there, this is a form of announcing al-ubudiyya, announcing ilm, submission in ilm, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His knowledge basically surpasses all. And certainly coming in, there's no ubudiyya. What does ubudiyya and what does submission actually bring? It brings in humility. What humility? It brings in humility, that the person comes in with khushu'. And that khushu', وَلَا أَعْلَمُ مَا فِي نَفْسِكَ. And I would not know what you plan. I would not know what you basically would judge or rule. It's basically, you are the Lord Almighty, for you are Allamul Ghuyub. You are the one that basically has all the knowledge that surpasses all. And therefore, we could see within this ayah, it basically contains one. Tawheed right there contains that tawheed in knowing al-uluhiyya, that tawheed in knowing al-rububiyyah, and also right there in al-asma, in the names and attributes, whether in the ilm or whether in recognizing, of course, what the implication of knowing that tawheed is. It's really taking in that khushu'. It's taking in that moment of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So comes in Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, and Tawheed al-Asma' wa-Sifat, right there, all the different tawheeds right there. إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ عَلَّامُ الْغُيُوبِ. And this is to let us know that we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is it, because I know you have to take your rest. Just wanted to do every single day, inshallah, we'll just do a really short tafsir. This is a short tafsir. To me, an hour is a short tafsir. And I usually get, warm up in the beginning, so I wouldn't consider the first 20 minutes until I get into the warm up. That's when I guess the inspiration comes in. So subhanakallah wa bihamdika nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. I know it's time for you all to take your rest and sleep. So if there are any questions, we'll take a quick question, inshallah. So I'll let you all sleep, inshallah. I guess this is it. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. I know you have a long day tomorrow, so we'll see you all tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.